Hey folks, it's Dr. Gilchrist. We are going to finish up our section on social psychology and finish strong by talking about relationships and altruism. So we're going to talk about a few different things. I'm going to try to keep it pretty short. So we're going to talk about how we develop strong relationships. We'll talk about some of our understanding of romantic relationships, and then also altruism and helping other people. So we're going to start by talking about how relationships form. And this is largely going to be true whether we are talking about romantic relationships or platonic relationships, such as the relationships that you would potentially have with a friend. They largely form in very, very similar ways. So what affects forming friendships and romantic relationships? And to be clear, some people are very, very, very introverted and do not necessarily need to have a lot of people in their lives. However, for most of us, we need to at least have a few types of social bonds to kind of to function. Many of us need friendships or familial relationships or romantic relationships. And it's not bad to admit that you need people in your life. Forming bonds with other people has been really important for our survival as a species, as we talked about back in chapter 9 when we talked about motivation. Having those social needs is what kept us alive, feeling like we belonged and other people were important to us and that we were important to other people has aided our survival as a species. And even Aristotle himself has said that there is nobody who would choose not to have friends, even if he were to have all of the other possible goods. Most of us require a friendship or a romantic relationship of some kind to feel connected to other people. And there are many different factors that can affect how relationships develop and how they're maintained. So one of the things that we're going to find is that proximity is largely going to play a role. So remember that I briefly talked about the mirror exposure effect last week. So this is basically the idea that the more familiar that you become with something, the more that you see something or the more that you hear something, you tend to like it more. So we tend to have a preference for the familiar. So one of the things that we find is that you are often going to be more likely to develop friendships or romantic relationships with people that you come into contact with frequently. So for many of you, especially if you're freshmen, you've probably formed a stronger bond with somebody who is in your suite than somebody who has not been in your suite. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. But by and large, proximity is going to play a role here. It's easier for you to spend time with people who are nearby. Additionally, because of proximity, you're going to have a greater familiarity with them, and that mirror exposure effect can kick in. So researchers have actually kind of looked at this. They have looked at, for example, people who live in apartment buildings, and what they tend to find is that the people who live by the stairs or by the mail areas tend to have more friends and get along with more people because those are high traffic areas where you're more likely to run into people. So the people who live by the stairs or by the mail area, the mail room, tend to be a bit more popular because people run into them more there. But similarity plays a role too. You are a lot more likely to form relationships with people who are like you in some sort of way. And that can be in terms of your attitudes, your beliefs, your values, your interests, and even your similarity in attractiveness. That's especially true for romantic relationship. So we tend to find people who are matched to us on our attractiveness level. This doesn't just include friendships, it also includes romantic relationships. By and large, you will tend to find that most couples are very similar in attractiveness. If they are not, oftentimes what we will find is that one partner has something additional that kind of compensates or brings something different to the table to basically help kind of compensate for that lack of attractiveness or that differential in attractiveness. So one of the other things that we find is that by and large, we like people who are likable. Anderson back in 1968 actually reported that people tend to like those that have traits that are valuable to a group. That includes things like kindness, dependability, trustworthiness. We tend to like people who have these qualities because these people are going to be easier to work with. And they're going to be valuable to a group and not just necessarily be in it for themselves. What's actually kind of interesting, though, is that we generally do not like it when people seem too perfect. So researchers have actually done this by having people basically have somebody be an applicant for a job interview, and they'll come in and they will give this interview and it will go really, really well. So then this was a study by Aronson back in 1968. So they have somebody else come through, give basically the identical type of interview, absolutely perfect, but then this person accidentally spills coffee on themselves. And here's what's actually kind of interesting. Aronson found that people tended to prefer the person that had spilled a little bit of coffee on themselves. We like small mistakes because it makes people seem more real. For whatever reason, when people seem too perfect, we do occasionally become suspicious and wonder if it's an act. There have definitely been some instances where I have been really nice and other people who tend to be a bit more cynical, a little bit more suspicious, and a little bit more disagreeable have occasionally accused me of being fake. I didn't realize that. I thought this is how you function. It's called civility. Even with somebody you don't like, you should probably be at least civil to them. But small mistakes, on the other hand, make us seem more authentic. They make us seem more real and not too perfect, because when we're around somebody who seems too perfect, we don't trust it. It's kind of cynical, frankly. So we have to talk about the importance of physical attractiveness. And this is especially true for romantic relationships. Generally, people who are physically attractive do tend to form relationships much more easily. Now, let's be really clear. So first of all, attractiveness. There are some objective aspects, but by and large, attractiveness is subjective. It is defined by a particular time. It is defined by a particular culture. But there are some physical features that are basically the same across all cultures. Generally, it's kind of important to have good hygiene. And then we also find that facial symmetry also tends to play a role. So one of the things that we find is that more symmetrical faces tend to be considered a bit more attractive than asymmetrical faces. Now, if you have an asymmetrical face, I know I do, I wouldn't worry about that too much. It doesn't mean that nobody's going to find you attractive. Abraham Lincoln, for example, had quite a bit of facial asymmetry. There are more things that become important than physical attractiveness. Physical attractiveness for many of us is a way to get our foot in the door, but you actually have to be an interesting person beyond that. So one of the things that is kind of a little frustrating is that for many people, attractiveness brings a lot of different social benefits. Generally, attractive people tend to be viewed as happier, more intelligent, more sociable, and less socially deviant. Now, let's be really clear. They are viewed that way. Just because you are viewed that way does not mean that you actually are that way. So, for example, physical attractiveness has no relationship to happiness whatsoever, but people tend to think that if they were more attractive, that they would be happier. They do tend to be paid more, and they tend to be more popular. Generally, attractive people do not lack for dates or friendships. There's this idea that sometimes people who are too attractive might be very lonely because everybody's too afraid to approach them, and the data doesn't really bear that out. And we do find that they are a bit more socially skilled. That is possibly because of the fact that more people want to be around them, and they've had to basically learn those social skills in a way that other people have not. So does beauty equal goodness. So part of the reason that we see these social benefits is because there is a stereotype that what is beautiful is good. By and large, a lot of the fairy tales that many of us grew up with, or the folk stories, typically will have a very beautiful, good princess and a very, very ugly, an ugly, evil person. Like the bad person is always ugly or evil or things like that. So we tend to have a very, very early preference for attractiveness. So we have this preference for attractiveness. Young children tend to prefer to look at prettier faces than uglier faces. They know that beautiful people tend to be the good guys, that ugly people tend to be the bad guys. And let's be clear though, they're not necessarily any smarter, they're not necessarily any happier, and generally it's unrelated to self-esteem. So I know that there are many of you, I know that I've sometimes thought about this, that if I were a bit more attractive, that maybe I'd like myself more, and that's not necessarily the case. We like to blame our looks as this magic bullet of, hey, if I had this, I might be happier. That is not necessarily true. I would encourage you to be happy with the person you are now. If you need to make changes, then make changes. But your life is not necessarily going to become any easier or any happier if you were more attractive. So focus on feeling good about yourself now. Now, what if you're not attractive? Is there hope? Now, thankfully, most of us are average. That's why it's the average. Most of us have average attractiveness. And I would remind you that mere exposure and the importance of familiarity can really play a role with this. So I have had so many instances where I have met somebody and I kind of looked at them and I'm like, yeah, they're okay. But then the more that I got to know them, the more that I got to understand how their mind worked, I would wake up one day and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I think they're hot. And yeah, are we talking like hot as in actor hot? Yeah, no. But all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I would realize how attractive they had suddenly become to me, not just because and really because I took the time to get to know them. Additionally, other traits can be viewed as attractive. So I grew up with my mother constantly saying this to me, pretty is as pretty does. It is not about what you look like. It's about how you treat people, how you act, how you behave. And so it's the things you do that make you attractive to other people or unattractive to other people. Having kindness can be a very attractive quality. Having a good sense of humor or being really, really intellectually curious can be very attractive for many people. And so just to be clear, if you are not attractive, it doesn't mean you are doomed to be alone. I know that there are industries that basically make you think that if you're not attractive, that you are hopeless, but that is not true. So let's kind of finish up by talking about love and romantic relationships, and then finish up by talking about altruism. So there are different types of love out there. So one of the things that we tend to find is that a lot of the ideas that we get about love and romantic relationships from movies have sold us a very grave disservice. First of all, have you ever noticed in like romantic comedies, usually around the third act, there's some dumb misunderstanding that probably would not have caused a breakup or a fight or something like that if people had actually talked to each other? I gotta say, the third act breakup / miscommunication is one of my pet peeves, because that's not how real life works. But the other thing that you'll kind of notice is that by and large, a lot of romantic movies are about people getting together, not necessarily staying together. And so a lot of these movies and television shows will focus on passionate love. This is the kind of love that we tend to see in TV and movies. It occurs very early in the relationship, and it's really short-lived. Generally, the emotions are basically going to have very high physical arousal. You're going to have that really high physical arousal there. But it doesn't really last very long. On the other hand, over time, as you stay in a relationship with somebody, this actually shifts from passionate love to what is called companionate love. And this is less about arousal or sex or lust or infatuation or anything like that. And it becomes more about having a very strong commitment and support for your partner. So rather than having this passionate, amorous, lustful thing, it's more based on friendship, trust, respect, and intimacy. And this is the only thing that really builds companionate love is time. So how do relationships change over time? Generally, one of the things that we know is that the long-term pattern of sexual activity changes, and there will be less passion for your partner over time. We tend to find that this peaks around the first year of marriage, and then it tends to decline. So how do we stay in love? One of the first things that we have to kind of recognize is that passionate love is going to fade. And it's very, very quick. It's going to fade within the first couple of years of a relationship. So if you are counting on that always being there, you are going to be very sorely disappointed. So recognizing the reality of the situation and that your feelings will shift and that passion will fade is important. The other things that are important are feeling like you're putting in as much as you're getting. So feeling like the relationship has equity. If you're in a one-sided relationship, it's probably, or if you perceive that you're in a one-sided relationship, even if you're not, that can be a real problem. Self-disclosure is also going to be a very critical thing. You have to be open about your thoughts and your feelings with your partner, and you need to feel like they're in a safe place to do that with you too. And these things can really help deepen the relationship and make the relationship a much firmer foundation after that passion fades. So additionally, one of the things that your book doesn't really talk that much about, but I think is kind of interesting, John Gottman has done a lot of work on relationships with his Love Lab. And so what he does is he brings people into his lab and he basically video records them having a conversation about something that causes a lot of conflict. And here's what's really important. You're not going to get along with your partner all the time. Anybody who tells you that you will always agree with your partner, that you will never fight with your partner, you need to be prepared for fights. It is going to happen. Anytime that you are making contact with another person, whether it's your partner or a friend, you are going to have conflict because you will not agree on everything. So Gottman films these people having a conflict. And he kind of pays attention to the videotapes and see what people do. Are they listening? What kind of facial expressions are they making? And so Gottman basically has what he calls the Four Horsemen. So just like we have a Four Horsemen that precede the apocalypse, we have Four Horsemen that Gottman believed predict the end of a relationship. So his Four Horsemen are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and something called stonewalling. So criticism is a little bit different from a complaint. So just to be kind of clear, and this comes from Gottman's own research, criticizing your partner is different than offering a critique or voicing a complaint. The latter two are about specific issues, whereas the former is an ad hominem attack. For those that don't know, ad hominem basically means it's an attack on your character. You're focusing on the person rather than something that you did. So you need to learn the difference between a complaint and criticism. Here's a complaint. I was scared when you were running late and you didn't call me. I thought we'd agreed we would do that for each other. Here's criticism. You never think about how your behavior is affecting other people, so notice the never. I don't believe you are that forgetful, you're just selfish. So it's less about, I wish you had done this particular action. It really bothered me that you did this action. It becomes less about what you did and more about who you are. You're selfish. You're forgetful. You never think of others. You never think of me. So criticism becomes an attack on your character. So contempt is basically treating others with disrespect, using sarcasm, using ridicule, calling them names, mimicking. If you're eye rolling a lot, it shows that you don't take them seriously and you don't respect their point of view. So contempt has a point of moral superiority. So here's an example. Oh, you're tired. Cry me a river. I've been with the kids all day running around like mad to keep this house going, and all you do when you come home from work is flop down on that sofa like a child and play those idiotic video games. I don't have time to deal with another kid. Could you be any more pathetic? So there's this moral superiority. I'm doing all this stuff. You're doing nothing. I'm better than you. And Gottman says it is the single greatest predictor of divorce. Defensiveness is basically a response to criticism. Basically, we feel accused. We try to fish for excuses. We basically try to defend and protect ourselves rather than saying, hey, you're right, maybe I shouldn't have done that. It becomes, well, I wouldn't have done it if you had done this. So it becomes defending and protecting and making yourself out to be innocent and being right instead of admitting that you were wrong. Stonewalling is basically a response to contempt. Basically, the listener is going to basically shut down, withdraw, and stop responding to their partner. So all of these things together are signs that a relationship cannot handle conflict. And it's showing a lack of respect, a lack of care for your partner, and not really seeing them as a person, but rather somebody who somebody you don't respect. Generally, Gottman has found that couples that stay together tend to express care for each other even when they're fighting. And additionally, happy couples they note the negatives, but they tend to overlook them compared to the positives over time. So we're going to finish up by talking about altruism and helping other people. So I've spent a lot of time in social psychology talking about the ways that we're terrible. We obey authority and potentially hurt another person. We're prejudiced. We get into group polarization. But we do occasionally behave in pro-social, helpful ways. So I want you to think about very recent events. Think about the ways that you have acted, for example, during storms, in particular, very recently, storms like Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria, caring for other people and donating to causes during the holiday season. Think about some of the things that you're doing right now, wearing masks, keeping your distance from other people, even though you really, really want to see them. So I'm not going home for Christmas this year, even though I am dying to see my family. It will be a year and a half since I've seen them, and that's the longest I've ever gone without seeing them, and I badly want to be there, but I don't want to put them at risk. So what are pro-social behaviors? Pro-social behaviors include things like providing assistance, doing favors for people, or cooperating and working together with other people. Now, what sorts of things affect whether or not we help others? Now, there are some people that would argue that it is in our nature to be selfish and protect ourselves, and thus altruism is contrary to our survival instinct. And I would argue that that is not true. Odds are pretty good when you look at the data. We actually have what is referred to as kin selection. So we tend to help our family first, and we also tend to help people that are pretty close to us. So we tend to be more likely to want to help our family because they have our genes than to help people who are random strangers. Not saying we don't help strangers, of course, but family tends to take precedence. Additionally, one of the things that we find is that we often help other people because in the future, if we need help, they'll be able to help us. So reciprocal helping actually aids survival of the species. If we helped and didn't get anything back for it, our species would not have survived. But this provides mutually beneficial aid. I would not necessarily say that there's not we can get into the discussion about whether altruism is truly selfless or selfish, but it does help survival of the species in ways that you might not have expected. So that affects whether or not we help. And also the presence of whether other people are around. will also affect whether we are likely to help. So it's very well documented that when other people, the more people that are around us, the less likely we are to help. And that's largely because of something known as diffusion of responsibility. So if I trip and fall and there are a lot of people around, very few of them are going to try to come and help me up or check me out and see if I'm all right. On the other hand, if you're the only one around and you see me trip and fall and are back and drop something, you might actually help me pick it up because you're the only one there. And the responsibility now falls on you. If you don't help me, you're going to look like a jerk. But if you're surrounded by 30 other people and you don't help me, you don't look so bad because there are other people around that could have helped. So generally, we are going to be less likely to help when other people are present. And that's due to that diffusion of responsibility. And when we're making this decision whether or not to help, we weigh certain factors. So that includes things like, is there a risk if I help? If I help, will this person hurt me or will somebody else hurt me? Here's one that's a little less charitable. Do I think this person is deserving of my help? Additionally, will other people recognize me if I help? So these are all different factors that come into play when we're trying to decide whether or not to help people. So folks, this is all I have for social psychology. I hope you have enjoyed this. We will talk about psychological disorders next time.